Coming up.
Canada, for example, piloted a program with the Netherlands, which was developed by the World Economic Forum, and it's basically a digital identity that's housed.
Oh boy, Mr. Israel, I think you might have just touched the third rail when you talked about World Economic Forum in this context.
But the WEF's known travel digital identity program, and I've certainly heard from many constituents that are concerned about the idea of a very powerful type of digital ID. The government has entered into or is participating in a pilot program.
This Guy's Garage. Like and subscribe.
Thank you. And I'd like to pick up on that. I could recall coming back through an international flight and being herded through an American Homeland Security checkpoint. I believe it was in Pearson, and the first time, having to contemplate iris scans. I'm wondering if the witnesses can speak, and perhaps we can start with Ms. Bhandari, about the way in which Nexus in our airports has her work in the States led to any investigations or research on Nexus's kind of public-private biodata collection service?
One of the areas that we have been concerned about is the expansion of facial recognition and other biometric technology in airports. So we haven't looked specifically at Nexus, but the same principle holds with, for example, Global Entry, the Global Entry system in the United States. And the concern, of course, is as people become required to provide face prints or iris scans to access essential services, going to the airport, crossing the border, entering a government building, it facilitates a checkpoint society, the likes of which we haven't seen before. And these are not contexts in which people can meaningfully opt out. So one clear area of regulation could be providing people with a meaningful opt-out. Saying that, if you don't want to prove your identity via an iris scan, we provide you the option to do so another way, with your passport, for example, with your Nexus card, for example. So the airport use and the border use, because it's such a coercive environment, because people don't have the choice to walk away, that's been a big concern.
Mr. Israel?
Yeah, so exactly what Ms. Bhandari was saying. It's a big problem because programs like Nexus are opt-in in a sense, but the pressure to get through the border and the explicit use of the border as a pain point to encourage travelers to sign up for these types of systems is a problem. Canada, for example, piloted a program with the Netherlands, which was developed by the World Economic Forum, and it's basically a digital identity that's housed on your phone that has a lot of your passport information and additional social identity verification program information. And the idea was to see if that could be used as in replacement of a passport to facilitate border crossings. And facial recognition was the technology that was built into that system. And the end vision of that system, and it's very explicit, is that you would get travelers to voluntarily sign up for this to avoid the delays at the border, because it gives you access to faster security processing. But then it later becomes available to banks, telecommunication companies, and other entities as well for similar identity verification programs.
Oh boy, Mr. Israel, I think you might have just touched the third rail when you talked about World Economic Forum in this context. But I do have an interest in, in your report when you talked about how some of the evidence suggests that Canadian border control agencies appear to be unaware of racial biases inherent in these systems. And what little public information is available suggests that these capabilities may have been assessed for general levels of inaccuracy, and they've not been assessed for racial bias. And I referenced that into the ongoing saga of the no-fly lists for kids. We literally in this country have children who have been flagged and identified and put on no-fly lists because they might have Muslim-sounding names or are caught up in some kind of bureaucratic nightmare, quite frankly, with trying to travel. So can you just talk about the risks that the lack of awareness of racial bias poses, particularly when we talk about having human guardrails in place to be able to help offset some of these inconsistencies and inaccuracies?
Certainly. So that is it's a very, very, very valid and salient concern. The no-fly lists have been a long-standing problem. And there have been proposals to create facial recognition enabled lists of with comparable objectives. CBSA did, in fact, pilot one for a while and decided, I think, not to implement it yet, but it is something that they piloted, and that's deeply problematic. More recent, the response from CBSA has been concerning. For example, one CBC report that tried to probe into the racial biases in one of their facial recognition systems, when they asked for more detailed breakdowns of error rates and racial bias rates, first it appeared through access to information requests that CBSA was not aware at the time of their adoption that these were real, and then later on the response was that there's a national security concerns with providing this type of error data, which is just not. There's in other jurisdictions this is publicly available. In other jurisdictions it's required to be publicly available by law. It's just that's not a good approach. More recently, there has been some very quickly developments in the sense that CBSA has announced it will try to implement a biometric study hub within its infrastructure, but we haven't really seen what's going in.
Before my round wraps up, I think about the nightmare that is Toronto Pearson, the 3-4 hour long waits for domestic travel because security lanes are closed. Do you think that this is the right preconditions for filtering people into things like Nexus? I know when I'm standing in line and I look at the business class or Visa or the Nexus lines, which are empty, do you think that the inconsistencies and the inefficiencies of our borders might result in a peak of people applying for things like Nexus?
I think it really is putting people in an unfair position to choose that's the only way that they can make their airport travel experience a little bit more unpleasant, a little less unpleasant, I should say. The direction that things are going is worse. Like there's proposals around the world to automate that streaming process, where like you'll walk up to basically a screen, you'll get a facial recognition scan. There'll be an assessment of your profile that gets pulled in digitally, and then you'll get automatically through gates channeled to like a high security, medium security, or low security line, and that will just be this on steroids. And again, like if you don't have the right profile in place to interact with
I can imagine where this is headed. I've been pulled out into secondary more than my fair share of time. Thank you very much.
Mr. Israel, you had referenced the WEF's known travel digital identity program, and I've certainly heard from many constituents that are concerned about the idea of a very powerful type of digital ID. The government has entered into or is participating in a pilot program. In that regard, do you have any concerns with the KTDI pilot program that you could outline to the committee, and in particular, if there's any concern about how a program like this may disproportionately affect certain elements of the population, whether it be people of color, racial minorities, young, old, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm very concerned. The pilot did get a little bit interrupted by the pandemic, and I don't know how aggressively it's being moved forward now. But I'm very concerned with the idea of using, sort of the pain point of the travel experience to encourage people to opt in and create these types of profiles, knowing that they're then going to be used against them, not just in border control contexts where many marginalized communities are already at a massive disadvantage. Here and abroad in other countries that end up implementing the same system because it's intended to be a global system, but also with the idea that these same systems are going to then be used by the private sector for fraud detection or identity management in interactions with private companies. The facial recognition component of this is a big part because all the errors there are going to, again, fall most heavily on members of invisible minorities and members of marginalized communities. But then the other assessment and social ranking mechanisms that are included in this identity verification program and will sit on your device and be linked to you through your facial recognition also tend to weigh very heavily and disproportionately against members of marginalized communities. So I think this is not the way to go, personally.
No, I appreciate that, and if you'd bear with me here, certainly I've heard from constituents who are concerned about, the inclusion of one's political beliefs as to whether or not they could travel, the inclusion of something like race as to whether or not you're allowed to rent an apartment, or a whole host of hypotheticals that could be included in some nebulous database that exists somewhere in a server that may or may not have human oversight. Certainly, that's something that I think we all need to be very, very careful of. Is that something that you would agree with?
Absolutely. And part of the challenges with this type of system is you're able to implicitly do, by relying on artificial intelligence assessment tools, you're able to implicitly do what you couldn't do directly. So you couldn't necessarily say, I'm not renting to you because you're Indigenous, but then you could adopt an algorithm that's, relies on biased historical data and ends up, coming to that conclusion without the opacity, without the transparency that would let someone challenge that type of decision explicitly. And that's a very big problem when we move towards these types of this broader set of assessment mechanisms. And again, facial recognition is a tool that really allows a lot of implementation of those types of mechanisms, and the KDTI profile has a lot of elements of that built into it.